Hi everyone. Um, 3 weeks ago or more ago, the death was announced of Mbella Sonne Dipoko, one of the greatest Cameroonian writers in English. Today I have here with me Mr. Njiwung Kitts, who is a teacher of literature and also a critic and a great follower of Mbella Sonne Dipoko. I'm here with him today to ask him a few questions concerning the writings and lifestyle of the man we know as Mbella Sonne Dipoko. You're welcome, sir.
Thanks. I met Mbella Sonne Dipoko in the late 80s, and it was an enchanting experience for me because as an undergraduate I had studied some of his poetry. I remained in close touch with him from the late 80s to his recent death early in December 2009.
So, if I may ask you, what are the main concerns of his writing?
He wrote poems, novels, short stories, and in most of his works, he is a committed artist. A committed artist in the sense that if you take a poem like Rulers, it is an indictment, a protest against the corrupt, tyrannical African leaders. But Dipoko was not just a committed writer. There are two functions of literature. The artist either writes to entertain or to instruct or to do both. In Dipoko's works, there are moments when he is just out to entertain. And at this level, Dipoko can be said to be one of the best romantic poets that Africa has ever produced.
Okay, so thank you. Now, many people often looked at him as a madman. For others, they looked at him as a strange man. So what difference can you draw between Dipoko the intellectual and Dipoko the private man?
An interesting thing about Dipoko is that he had spent 30-something years in France, Spain, the US, and unlike most of his friends, Césaire, Senghor, Damas, and so on, who became assimilated and became virtually spokesmen for the French culture, in spite of the fact that they were writing negritude poems to denounce and advocate, to stress the cultural heritage of the black man, because the French policy of assimilation was a dangerous policy because it denied the black man his humanity. So Dipoko was surprised that Senghor, Césaire, and so on, they wrote poetry to assert the cultural identity of the black man. And then at the end of the day, they became so assimilated that they became, in a sense, spokesmen for Western civilization, the French culture essentially. That is why in reaction to what they had done, the way they were behaving, he felt that it was not enough for the poet to talk about the authenticity of African culture. What was more to the point was that the poet's life, the poet's lifestyle should reflect the values embedded in his poetry. And that is why he strove to remain as natural as possible. And to some of the Africans, less enlightened Africans, they often saw him as a madman. But in an interview, he himself told someone that for the several years that he was abroad, nobody ever looked at him as a madman. They would see him as a romantic, perhaps the last of the romantics. But he was surprised that when he came back to Africa, he would stop taxis, and the taximen could not stop to pick him because they felt that he was mad. And in another conversation, he asked that, but if these people are scared of a mere beard, then what will they do when war comes? You see? So he considered the people who saw his beard and his head of hair and considered him to be a madman or a lunatic as Philistines, who were afraid of originality, who wanted merely to be the caricatures of Western culture.
So if I may understand from what you're trying to say is that Dipoko was a pragmatist who felt that you should practice effectively what you preach.
Of course, he was, to an extent. To an extent.
To an extent.
Yes, because there are poems in which he himself talks about doing his revolution in the head, while at heart it seems as if he belongs to the West. Because there was an occasion where he made love to an Irish girl under the rain, the thunder and so on. And then later on, he said he started crying. And why was he crying? Because he saw the contradiction inherent in his lifestyle. Talking about the whites as oppressors, as colonizers, and then at the same time remaining in the West and falling in and out of love with Western girls. So, in fact, it is obvious that he himself seems to have realized this contradiction in his private life.
Okay, yeah. If I may digress a little bit away from Dipoko, let's look at it's a general fact of life that it's difficult for someone to stick to what they preach. So could we say Dipoko fell also prey to this human tendency?
Yes, of course. Not only at the emotional level, but even at the political level, because he embarrassed most of his admirers when at one point he joined the CPDM party, Cameroonian CPDM party under Biya, whose regime, he had criticized in his articles, in some of his works and so on. And so when people try to question him that, but you have embarrassed us, it doesn't make sense that you talked about corruption, you denounce corruption in your poetry, and then at the same time you become, one of the main pillars to foster these corrupt practices. When I met him personally, he told me that he didn't join the CPDM party because he believed in its political ideology. He joined the CPDM party because he had realized that given the present dispensation, perhaps it was easier to change things from within than shouting invectives from a safe distance. So if in the end he never succeeded to influence political ideology in that party, it is because of the way things are in Africa in general.
Okay, thank you. So let's go back to Dipoko and let's talk about his mysticism. One characteristic, many people don't know him as a mystic, but we know that he practiced mysticism. So to what extent can we say his mysticism permeated his writing?
Dipoko was a mystic. And it is interesting to note that to an extent, all great poets are mystics. Because what we call the poetic muse is a spirit. What else can it be? The poetic muse is the voice that is dictating to the poet,
Yeah.
And this voice is not the voice of some other human being that is hiding somewhere and telling the poet that put down this and so on. So Dipoko was a mystic, and this could be easily understood. It can be easily understood within the context of his being a great poet, because all great poetry is inspired. That is why in one of his poems, when he was in London at the time, he talks of how on a certain night the spirits told him that the time had come for him to die. And he refused, and told them that only God can shuffle the cards of destiny. That the spirits did not have the power to tell him that the time had come for him to die. You see, now this is interesting, because how many human beings can communicate with spirits to that extent that he was doing? In yet another poem, Dipoko, having fallen in love with an English girl and loved her for quite some time, at one point he got money and gave to this girl that you will take this money and go and live somewhere else, so that I can remain behind and be able to communicate with the keepers of solitude, the oracle of the poets. And so it becomes very obvious that his passion for communicating with these spirits, it was not something very abnormal, very strange, because this is what most poets do. If you take someone like William Blake, you know, he spent most of his life conversing with angels and spirits and so on, you know. And this is a normal thing in the creative world, you know, because all original poetry must be inspired. In fact, this mystical experience found its climax in what Dipoko came to call the vision of the marvelous star. After spending some time in Spain, Morocco, Paris, you know, on one night he had a vision, and he says God was dictated to him the same as God had dictated to Moses on Mount Sinai, the same as God had dictated to Muhammad. And then it was at that point when he had this vision of the marvelous star that he came up with his new faith, Esimo Yamboka.
Okay, so let's talk about Esimo Yamboka. What are the main tenets of this religion?
According to Dipoko, Christianity, coming from the West, was a tool for Western imperialism, colonialism, a tool for Western culture. And so even if Christianity has elements of truth, spiritual truth, Dipoko, no, after this vision, realized that the Africans needed a religion of their own. A religion which would, you know, ensure the unity of all Africans. The cultural, religious, and socio-authenticity of the African heritage. This is why he set to writing, and for 30-something years, he was writing this holy book, which unfortunately, he finally died without publishing it.
Okay, this is a misfortune, because with so many noble ideas about African spirituality, African development, he finally ended up not publishing anything. So, what do you think is the fate of this Bible, as we stand at this moment in time?
I want to think that not only Dipoko's family members, other African intellectuals, you know, if they show enough concern, it is possible to meet the family and then have access to some of these documents so that they can be handed down to posterity.
Okay, the next question I would like to ask, I would like you to dwell on is to use one or two of his works, maybe his poems or prose, in order to demonstrate his artistic style and vision.
I think one of his best poems is Rulers. And as the title suggests, the poem is about African rulers. Dipoko felt that there was a leadership vacuum, not only in Cameroon, but in all of Africa. And so in Rulers, Dipoko uses a type of apocalyptic vision to foresee what would be the fate of these corrupt, tyrannical dictators. This is how the poem reads. This is a rainy night. Rulers unroll scrolls of wretched landscapes and boast and drink and dance under chandeliers in castles threatened like pleasure boats in a furious ocean. They are like insects that dance around street lamps, looming in the fog of a stormy sky. This is a seismic night. Water divide hills, sink into valleys, and rivers flow backwards. Our faces and farms drip with salt water from the flooded ocean. But while our hope splits like leaves in winter, we must seek the reticent seagull before mourned by stray crows. Such is the fate of the wicked kingdom, governed by gorgeous.
That really is a powerful point. So, could you Could you use the poem now to elaborate more on his vision, what he thought Africa could be, or say Cameroon, or the society to which he was writing?
He attributed, as we can see from the second line of this poem, the wretchedness, the misery of the Africans to these rulers. Because when he talks about the wretched landscapes, what he means is that as a result of, the greed, these rulers have become shameless money grubbers and they wallow in wealth while their citizens are suffering, have been reduced to wretchedness, misery. Now, he also sees these rulers as people who are insignificant, but they don't seem to understand. He sees them as people who are as imbecilic as little insects that loom around street lights when there is about to be a storm, because he says, these rulers are like insects, and the use of the image of the insects shows how insignificant Dipoko considers these African leaders to be. In Upheaval, even he compares these African leaders to rats, because he says on a sinking throne a rat sat waiting its turn to die. What is the basic attribute of a rat? A rat is filthy. A rat likes to steal and hoard things and so on. And so you see, Dipoko, is a great poet, because again, in another simile, he compares these rulers to people who are sailing in pleasure boats in a furious ocean, which means that they don't seem to be conscious of the impending doom. And we have witnessed several instances where after all this, quite often what happens, is the catastrophe, which becomes inevitable. Yes, when people loot and exploit and extort, and then they don't give a damn, they don't care a damn about what the less privileged people are feeling. Nature must ensure that certain forces come in to purge the society of this. And in this particular poem, the rain serves as that force which will inevitably act as a cleansing force. The revolution as envisaged by Dipoko in this poem, would not be brought about by the proletariat, as Marx envisaged.
Yeah.
It would be brought about by the forces of nature. Yes, coming in to purge society of these ills.
Yeah, so this brings me to a point. In one of his poems, which is also widely quoted, history, our history, where he talks about the poem in which he's talking about the invasion of when the whites came to Africa.
Yeah.
Now, we also see elements of nature, and he even talks about dripping in tatters like the whip wings of butterflies.
Exactly.
And what I realize is that his imagery has a lot. His imagery has a lot to do with nature. Could we attribute his nature imagery to his mysticism, considering the fact that African religion is mostly a nature-based religion? So could we build any link between this?
To an extent, but Dipoko described himself as a romantic, and Wordsworth has defined romantic poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. The romantic poets were the first poets of nature, and that is why in Dipoko's poetry we are never far from nature. Be it love poetry, be it the poetry of indictment and so on. And so, but nature to the African is, something special, because we believe in nature. We are natural, as opposed to the West, where technology has probably displaced some of these values. Yes.
Okay, maybe another comment which I thought I could raise up. Back in 1995, when I was a young undergraduate and struggling at the university, we had a conference at the Alliance Franco-Cameronaise in Boya, and Mbella Sonne Dipoko was guest speaker. So the one question which a student asked him was, what was the topicality of his poetry? Because the student said, when we read your poetry, we see revolution, we see fire. But when we look at your life, you are mayor. At that time, he was mayor of Tico.
Yeah.
So the student concluded that Mbella Sonne Dipoko was a failed prophet. So Dipoko told him that if that is his conclusion, he should keep it to himself, but he didn't think himself a failed prophet. So what can you draw from this?
The student must have been talking from the perspective of a young undergraduate. You know, we cannot say that Senghor failed as a negritude poet because he joined the French Parliament and things like that. What you are interested in is whether the works of an author are such that they can influence posterity. They can, you know, convert people, you know, to embrace new values and so on. It is not the poet's personality per se, because if the poet's personality were to be what would, you know, ensure that posterity's works, you know, survive, you know, stand the test of time, we will not be studying Shakespeare. We will not be studying, you know, the other great writers.
You're right. You're right. You're right. Okay. I think I'm done with my questions concerning Dipoko. But if you have any last word concerning what we've been talking about,
I would like to encourage people who did not even have access to Dipoko's works to ensure that they try to read some of his writings, because I believe, as I say, that his works can help to lay the foundation stone on which the African city of tomorrow can be erected. That is why I'm still convinced that the Holy Book must by all means be published.
thank you very much.
You're welcome.